Thank you very much. It's absolute pleasure being here. So what we're going to cover is how we're using AI logistic carbon twins for multimodal emission transportation. Why is that critical? Well, in simple terms, every single thing in this room was part of the supply chain. Every single thing, either upstream or downstream. But to be more precise, every single thing was in a shipping container. Upstream again, downstream again. It was not until tariffs came in with Trump and everyone got all excited about what's happening and how are we going to reshift our global supply chain. So it's quite sad that only when something negative happens in industry, especially in shipping, that we see the critical importance of why what we do is so important. So what are we doing? Well, in simple terms, carbon emissions across the supply chain is a complicated task. How do we figure out how many carbon emissions per gram, per ton mile of a truck in Bangladesh? How do you figure it out how much is on a ship? Difference between an 8, 15, 22,000 TEU ship, feeder vessel or ocean carriage. How do we figure out, again, equally the emissions on a truck here in the UK that's moving that same exact container of T-shirts, for example, from Liverpool to Birmingham? That's what we're trying to figure out. How do we connect all those dots together using a digital twin? Now, to many of us, Scope 3 emissions may still seem far off, but the reality is that it is actually right around the corner. And there are some complexities with regard to measuring emissions on the Scope 3. What we find quite fascinating about this is that many companies were already net zero Scope 1 and Scope 2. We saw this happening in the media last 2-3 years ago. At the moment, we're seeing very few companies saying that they're net zero by 2030. We need to ask ourselves why this is the case. Well, simply because Scope 3 itself will be added to that basket. Everyday companies like Uber, any idea how much emissions exist in Uber Scope 3? Any ideas? Random guess from the audience. Choose any number. Percentage-wise. Yeah. 70%? Any other guesses? One more guess. A bit higher, significantly higher. No. No, 99.9%. And that's from their, let's just go back to the GLEC model. So as I said, it provides a really good baseline in setting some type of way that we can measure emissions. And as I was highlighting here, we have what's called estimated distance, multiplied by estimated weight, multiplied by, of course, your emissions factor. And that's just, again, average numbers, estimating. But to really move the needle, as one person asked a while ago, or to make an impact, if you can't measure it, you can action it. And those of you in the maritime space know that, of course, emissions from shipping and the logistics supply chain accounts for over 3.4%, which is the size of Germany's emission, the 5th largest. So imagine you guesstimating this problem. You cannot really think about moving into the future and having a positive, real impact on climate change and supply chain if we are guesstimating in terms of the magnitude of the problem or the challenge we're facing. So what we're trying to do is make all of this easy, actually. We're not trying to make the world more complicated. We're just trying to make it actually much more simple. So what we've put together is our logistics twin. And this is now moving away from, as I said, the static numbers, which are average numbers, to a dynamic set. So one of the things that we have on our shipments are IoT devices. So we have a tracking device, which you can stick it onto a consignment, as you can see here, a consignment from London to Birmingham, and it will track the actual partway of the carriage. And then it will recalculate that. So we're pulling information, now actual distance, not just the Google Map distance that most of the carbon calculators are using. It is telling the actual distance. Then we're replacing with actual weight, of course, voluntary gross mass, which is a IMO requirement on containers. So it tells you the actual weight of that container. And then we're moving again to a dynamic factor as opposed to the static average emissions used on the GLEC. And by doing this now, we're incorporating weather, traffic, topography. We're pulling in information from open databases like Thetis MRV, maritime traffic, if we need to track the ship actually across borders, an entire through the supply chain. And then together, now what we'll get is a more significant measurement of that emissions. And we're going to look at a bit at some of our customers where we're seeing there's, of course, clearly a difference between the static model and the dynamic model. We're not saying that the static model is not good. We're saying it's not good for scale in trying to challenge and, of course, provide a proper solution to greenhouse gas globally. So what we have now is separate models within there. So we have the marine model, which, as I said, we're pulling data from different open databases. We have the land model, which we're, again, pulling information there. We haven't really done much work on the airline model yet. That will be our next target because most of our customers that we're working with are mostly land and sea. And then from there, we can now spit out more accurate carbon emissions. So then the real underlying question is, why is all this important? Well, we know that to challenge carbon emissions, we need to have a reduction strategy. And also what we're looking at is carbon insetting. I'm assuming persons may be familiar. So offsetting is you just plant a tree for every whatever you emit or you pollute. Insetting now, on the other hand, is how do you actually reduce it. And one of the fundamental shifts that we are going to see in the supply chain is that supply chains are going to get longer and they're going to get slower. And this is already happening with the conflict as we see on the Red Sea issue. We perceive that's going to continue. Those of you in shipping know that we've been slow steaming since about 2010, 2011. That slow steaming is not just going to be on the maritime leg. We're going to see that happening on the land leg. And with our product, what we're going to do is open these windows for green corridors where, for example, a driver who's going to pick up the same cargo in Bangladesh, we're going to see results in a bit, will pick it up at a later time. If he or she will picking it up at 2 p.m., will be stuck in traffic, carbon emissions will be 10, 15% more. Also, when it rains, your carbon emission goes up between 15 and 20%, believe it or not, because it creates an automatic traffic jam. So AI will already tell you predictions. You're going to have a delay, which you need to know for operational reasons, but that delay can work out in your favor if you wait until the rain finishes in 3 hours and you pick it up, and as a result, your cargo can now move through the supply chain. But you will now need to have that sharing, same like charters and ship owners are sharing on the seaside. You need to have that insetting sharing between the driver of that truck and the cargo or receiver or owner of that cargo who has to pay this environmental levy. So to summarize the future, what we're looking at is that we already anticipate the next layer will be even more dynamic, where we'll be able to stream directly emissions data from land-based like Geotab, ports like Port Exchange, DNV in the vessel data operational, so we know that we will be able to pull that stuff in, and also from airlines through climate. So what our platform will allow is this plug-and-play integration where as the data from all these carbon emissions become much more dynamic in real time, then it will come into our platform and you can have this real-time understanding of what's happening. Final slide again now around the challenges. Of course, for the AI to be advanced and to work, you need larger amounts of data sets, and that's one of the challenges we're faced. So we're in early stages thinking around this concept of federated learning, how our AI can be placed on top of data sets, learn from that, and from there, then we can bring it back in and we can use that, as I said, to identify green corridors, identify times of days that it is better for you to have pickup and delivery of your cargo based on weather, based on traffic, based on any other uncertainty that happens. And by doing that, we can optimize using our AI logistic twin as a way of reducing carbon emissions. And again, why is all of this important? Because every single thing in this room was in a supply chain. Even the wheels on the bus that go round and round, on the train that goes round and round, you leave here, or your kid's bicycle that wheels that go round and round, everything was in a supply chain and it was in a container. So we are trying to provide that real-time emissions reporting so that companies now can all meet their net zero targets. And quite simply, we
Brilliant, thank you very much. Leif, please, if I could, to you. With Scope 3 emissions, how do you ensure that you don't double count emissions? For example, container ships transporting goods from China to Europe.
Okay, that's a brilliant question. Well, most accounting software or the methodology on the GLEC will prevent the double counting. But our AI dynamic model, which is quite fascinating, is that we're pulling information from Thetis MRV directly, which is a European database. So any vessel over 5,000 gross tons that enters European waters has to have reported and does, of course, your DNV knows it should be audited by a reputable company. So we're replacing the average number with the actual carbon intensity index, CII, of that actual shipment on that actual ship, because that information will be on the bill of lading. What was the carrier for that leg? So that will, again, the methodology on the GLEC prevents double counting. But from our model's point of view, we will actually use the ship data from China to Europe.
Our last question we have currently is, Leif, to yourself, have you identified any failures in global supply chains? As in, are some of your clients using insights to form procurement processes and logistics planning?
So the answer to that, of course, is yes and no. So we're not at scale like Flexport, for example, where every 2 days the CEO is on TV explaining what's happening, maybe Trump tariffs or the Red Sea. But from our client's perspective, yes, they can see where the cargo is in real time, where the delays are occurring. And this is independent of carrier data, so we're not pulling any data because we have IoT devices actual in each shipment. So they can, just like Uber, pop their mobile phone up and they can see where it is. That allows them to building their own resilience. The future development of the platform will be focused on actually that, with regard to the ability that you can trade cargo in containers for the first time. So at the moment where you can trade commodities like oil and bauxite, you can trade a container full of mobile phones. That's about 1 point something to 2 million. It can be on a ship. It can be 20 days out, 10 days out. You can be sitting in Hamburg. You need it again in Liverpool, and you can pay a premium. So and this is where you build. This is where the resilience is built in, because your container that was supposed to arrive in Liverpool, it's stuck, it's delayed, something has happened. You need to have a backup plan. So at the moment, there's no way you can find a container afloat or shipment afloat to acquire it to fill that gap. And the same thing with T-shirts. Most of the products in the full loaded containers are generic. So you'll have full container of teacups, let's call it pharmaceuticals, etc. So this again creates a whole entire new business model which never exists. And based on that, for example, if we have another COVID, where most governments were blind or most companies were blind with regard to where their assets are, with IoT devices and what we have, that visibility is just there, point-click shift. So we have an entirely new future where you can have this resilience built in.
Perfect. And our final question for the panel, please, again to yourself, is what percentage of companies' emissions, in average, are Scope 3? And how do you see this changing over the next 10 years?
So it depends on the company, of course. But any company that's a retailer, over 85 to 90% of their emissions in Scope 3. So Walmart, in the USA, for example, here Tesco, Sainsbury's, wherever you buy your groceries, we're talking about 80 to 95. And as I said, transport companies, Uber being on one extreme, 99.9% of the emissions are in Scope 3 for Uber. So you can consider that for most of the trucking companies. For example, in the UK, like Wincanton, you're talking about 95% and above are in there, because they're moving either air when it's empty or they're moving cargo when it's full. So Uber is moving air when it's empty, and then it's moving cargo when it's full. So that means and this is why optimization is important. In terms of the next 10 years, that's precisely what I was saying. Moving forward, we cannot just be offsetting. That doesn't get us to Scope 3. We've spoken to quite large multinational companies, and for the trajectory growth rate in sales, even if they're offset, they cannot be at net zero, anywhere close to net zero. So that's where the insetting needs to come in and the reduction needs to come in. But for you to have a reduction and insetting strategy, you need to have data-driven decision makings. And you need to de-risk your supply chain, coming back to resilience. So most companies are scared to move from airlines, for example, to sea freight, transit time from 8 hours, for example. Flowers coming from Kenya to the UK, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas, Valentine's, whatever. Moving it out onto a ship, it's going to be about 2 weeks. But there's a risk now, which is uncertainty, because the ship, you cannot track a ship in real time, or you cannot respond to the delay in airlines that you can respond to a ship. And that's why to have this insetting and to have this reduction strategy moving forward in the next 10 years, when the low-hanging fruit is all gone, is the biggest challenge. So that is where in the next 10 years, where lots of AI just in time for ships is critical, because that has a knock-on impact on pickup time. That has a knock-on impact, as I said, with weather in city ports like Southampton or Liverpool, for example. So if the ship is late and it's raining, then you know picking up makes no sense because you're going to be stuck in traffic, etc. So it's streamlining using what we call cargo and carbon intelligence is what's going to drive the next 10 years.